Welcome to the Wisdom of Show. I'm your host, Simon Bowen, and every week I'm speaking to the world's greatest leaders, thinkers, and entrepreneurs about complex issues and impactful leadership. Join us in the Renaissance of Wisdom. Well, welcome to the Wisdom of, and I am so excited to introduce Sheila FitzPatrick to the show for this episode because it's a big topic. And whilst Sheila started her career, in employment and data, the focus of her work today is really privacy, security, and what are we doing about that in the world that we live in? She's recognized as an international employment data protection attorney with world level standing on this. I do want to read out some things. One of the world's leading experts in data privacy laws and works closely with the US government, Council of the European Union, where we know privacy has been a large focus, and country-specific privacy protection agencies in Europe, Asia, the Pacific, the Americas, and national work councils, and law enforcement, and so many more. Imagine, though, that as a part of your career bio, every time you walk down the corridor in the workplace, people either tried to avoid you or asked you how can they get around this thing that they shouldn't do, or they saw you as a barrier that's stopping them from doing something they want to do. And in reality, you're making sure that you can continue to operate, that the business has great security in place, has great privacy protection in place, recognized as one of the women redefining the future of business, recognized as, I love this title, Sheila, the Cybersecurity Woman of the World in 2024. It's like, remember the Bionic Man series? Yes. It feels a little bit like that. That's just fascinating. The Cybersecurity Woman of the World in 2024. How does that even happen?
I don't know. It's pretty profound. It's a group of there was a number of women that were nominated and honored for the Cybersecurity Woman of the World Award. There's an incredible woman by the name of Carmen Marsh who founded the United Cybersecurity Alliance, right. And she's pulled together an incredible group of women from every continent of the world, and so it's quite an honor to be among these incredible women.
Well, not only is it an honor to be among them, but it's a critical part of the world today, not just business, but the world today. I think there's no doubt that aggression of the future may well start at a cyber level rather than a physical level. And we know that, people's personal identities are kind of at risk at almost every level these days. Data is at risk. And, there's a difference, between security, if you like, and privacy. So we want to talk about that a little bit, but can I start off with what drew you to this? I mean, it is not a normal, pre-show I was saying to you, I don't think anyone in school kind of goes, I think I'm going to be a data privacy and cybersecurity attorney, and I'm going to spend decades doing that. So how did you get there in the first place?
Well, it was really interesting. You're absolutely right. Because even when I was in law school, I went to Trinity College in Dublin, Ireland for law school. And I went for international employment law. Privacy wasn't something that people were talking about. Although in Europe, at that time, it was an inherent part of human rights is to have, your fundamental right to privacy. And I've always felt that. It's always been ingrained in me that every individual has the right to privacy. I grew up in a very large Irish Catholic family, and, we were very open about talking about various subjects and topics. And I always felt that some things were off the table and some things could be on the table. But I thought that everyone had a right to share what they wanted to share and not share what they didn't want to share. So, inherent need for some level of privacy. So anyway, going to Trinity and focusing on the employment law, when you're in Europe, you can't really do employment law and not get involved in the privacy side.
Right.
And so I just sort of fell in that direction because I loved it so much. And this was well before even the first EU directive on data privacy came into place. It was years and years, decades before the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR that everybody talked about, came out in 2018. And I was one of the few, probably you could name three people that were doing privacy law at that time. And I just absolutely fell in love with it. And I worked, for the defense industry, which obviously had very serious privacy issues in terms of not only the work they were doing, but the type of data they were collecting. So it's just become an absolute passion of mine, and I love it. It's certainly taken on a life of its own. There's people have jumped on the bandwagon since GDPR. So you see a lot of people now saying, I'm a privacy expert, and I want to go, yeah, really? Where were you 40 years ago? Before everybody thought it was the cool, space to be in.
Let's actually let me diverse a little bit. I'm going to come back and ask you what some of the pivotal you've outlined some of those in terms of the story, but what might be some of the pivotal approaches that shaped your perspective about data and privacy sovereignty. But you just raised an interesting question, because in terms of data privacy security, there are a lot of people setting up shop fronts around the world saying, hey, I'm an expert on the GDPR. That really triggered a whole, I remember when it triggered a whole lot of people saying, oh, your CRM has to be compliant, your websites have to be compliant. I'm an expert in this stuff. And if we think about wisdom, I'd love to, if you think about it through the lens of your expertise, how often are you relying on the entire collected historical wisdom that you've built over time because you spent decades at this, as opposed to the GDPR's come out, now I'm going to study that and find out what people have to do? I suspect, if we split it, what percentage is just brute force wisdom because you spent so long in the trenches versus what percentage is, I'll understand the GDPR and advise people? I'm interested in your perspective on how much you lean on the collected wisdom you've got over time.
I would say 100% of the time I rely on the wisdom that I've gathered over the years, and certainly the foundation that I started with in terms of what defines privacy and how you address privacy versus security, how they're aligned and how they're different. Falling back on the initial laws that came out, whether it was part of human rights, your fundamental right to privacy in different jurisdictions around the world, whether it was the first EU directive on data protection that came out in 1998. Nobody was talking about privacy at that time. It was sort of, you had some conversations about it, but organizations really didn't know how to deal with it. So I would go in and advise and explain to them why it was critical to pay attention to privacy and what some of the concerns would be, some of the sanctions that could occur. But there wasn't a lot of, to be honest, a lot of teeth behind the sanctions at that time. It really wasn't until the GDPR, which was the first multi-territorial, extraterritorial law that impacted organizations around the world, even when they didn't have a presence in the EU. And the good part about that was it really changed the dynamic. I certainly had input. I worked with the EU on the GDPR, so having my background, being able to feed some of the principles and some of the challenges that companies were going to face. One of the negatives I'd have to say that happened was people saw the GDPR as sort of we're going to jump on the bandwagon. This is a moneymaker.
Yeah.
And GDPR became the biggest revenue generator for law firms and consultancies, bigger than the FY 2000 when it came out.
Is that right?
It was a huge, huge money generator because all of a sudden you had law firms and big consultancies saying, "Oh, we're privacy experts," and I'm going, "Really?" And I would have conversations with people and say, "How did you become an expert from the day that the GDPR was released so that you could look at it, which was in 2016, before it came into play in 2018? How did you become an expert in 2 years when it was still being defined and you had never done privacy before that?" And so that's what really, where the focus became more on people talking about security as opposed to really talking about privacy. A lot of technical people with IT backgrounds, definitely a need out there to have that strong IT background, but a lot of them saw privacy as sort of, this could be a career advancement, because if you can get to be a data protection officer, those roles are protected in many jurisdictions. So what happened was you sort of had this conflict because you had people that really made decisions about the technology now saying they're making decisions about privacy. And it was definitely a conflict of interest. Even the regulators were calling it a conflict of interest because you can't do both. You either have to focus on the privacy and the legal and ethical aspects, and then work closely with your IT and security people to lock that data down. But if you're locking the data down, you shouldn't be making the decisions on what data is being collected. That has to be made by the data protection officer, the privacy attorney, the business itself that knows what data they need. It was an eye opener in 2018 to see that. And then organizations came out with certifications, and all of a sudden everybody's getting certified, even though certifications aren't recognized by most jurisdictions. So it's kind of interesting to see that as well. But it's certainly a growing area.
Yeah. Well, we were well and truly in flow with our consulting business when Y2K hit in 2000, and I didn't think I'd see anything of that size again in terms of driving consulting. I mean, that's all anybody talked about
Yeah.
during 1999, right? Was Y2K. But of course, privacy and data security are big issues. And this idea, you've already hinted that um, through the lens of an Irish and European perspective, privacy is a fundamental human right, which is different to privacy because it's a business security risk. Let's make sure we manage that. And so you talk a little bit about privacy and data sovereignty. Would you just unpack, and what caused that emerging perspective, this idea of sovereignty, to come out for you?
Well, the sovereignty issue really has become more prominent in the last several years, and that's because of certainly with the introduction. I mean, the cloud's been around forever, but the introduction and more use of the cloud in the last 10 years, where data centers could be located anywhere in the world. And if you're working with a big cloud provider, you oftentimes can pick where you want the data center to be so that you know where your data is on. Like in Australia, for instance, the data is supposed to reside within Australia due to the sovereignty regulations. However, organizations that are choosing to move to the cloud, and the cloud is a great technology, so I'm not bad mouthing it by any means. But what happens is they don't do the privacy due diligence, which is asking the question about, even though we're picking the data center in Australia, what data center picks up the load if the data center goes down in Australia? Where is the data backed up and replicated? Now, that may be within country, but that may be in a different jurisdiction. And if the cloud provider has a model, a follow the sun model, that data can be accessed from outside of Australia because the support is going to be anywhere in the world where they would have a call center or a data center. So what happened over time is that as more and more countries introduced data protection laws that were either equal to the GDPR or more extensive than the GDPR, so the strictest law in the world is actually South Korea and not the GDPR.
Right.
But what happened was countries became concerned and said, Europe, for instance, said, we don't want data going to the US because the US has inadequate data protection laws. And so the whole concept of data sovereignty came into play where they said, we don't want our data hosted outside of the country. And China wants all their data hosted within China. They don't want anyone to get access to that data. So a lot of countries talk about data sovereignty, but the reality is if you're in, the cloud or you're in AI technology or there's a follow sun model supporting your infrastructure, your data in one way, shape, or form is going to be accessible from outside of the country of existence, your primary country. So what happens now is that there's a big push to get off of the reliance on US-based multinational technology companies. And there's a big push in Europe to develop their own, cloud environments or own technology. Right. Certainly a push in Asia Pacific and Australia to move in that direction. It'll be a while. And that's not, again, I am not bad-mouthing the US companies at all. They're fantastic companies, but privacy and sovereignty are definitely an issue.
Yes. Interesting because it's challenging. So with privacy laws varying. I mean, I think about 160 countries or so, lots of countries with their own privacy laws. And, I run a business that's international. We have clients all around the world. how does one even manage? I could stop the question there. How do you even manage that?
So I work with a lot of companies that have that very same issue. And first of all, you have to have, a data privacy expert that's there to help you, either, external or internal. And the way I always tell my clients is that you can't do privacy piecemeal. So if you are a multinational company, you can't say, well, we're going to handle privacy this way in Australia, we're going to handle it this way in the US, we're going to have it this way in Canada, this way in Europe, etc. What you need to do is build a foundation of privacy that's global. And you need to decide, okay, which jurisdiction do we want to base our global program on? Anywhere from 75% to 80% of the data protection laws are the same around the world. So you can build that foundation, and then you say, okay, let's look at the EU, the GDPR. That's the model that most companies use as their standard. Because once you implement that, you've met the requirements in probably 100 of the countries. And so then you look at the 60 remaining countries and you say, all right, are they more restrictive or less restrictive? So the US is definitely less restrictive. Australia's Privacy Act is less restrictive, but more restrictive than the US. So you decide, do we want to adopt a more restrictive model so that as the laws start to change, we're already ahead of the game and we don't have to backtrack? Or do we want to build that, sort of that framework and then tweak it based on what we need for each country? So I always advise my clients, if they're global, they need to build a global privacy program. And you hear a lot of organizations say, just for, you mentioned websites where they'll say, well, we don't allow people in Europe to access our website because our website isn't compliant with the GDPR. And I said, well, that's not a practical approach, because what happens if someone from Europe has a yahoo.com account or Hotmail account or, a generic email account? You're not going to know necessarily where they are. And if they're traveling, they may not be in Europe. They could be anywhere accessing your website. They could be in the US accessing your website, but you still have to comply with the GDPR because that's where they hold their residency. So this idea where we can block people, which a lot of companies do, isn't really a practical way to approach it.
Wouldn't you, if South Korea has the most rigorous regulations, laws in the world, is the reason why you wouldn't just go to those and say, we're going to apply those, and we know then that we're probably across it for the vast majority of the countries that have data privacy laws in place? Or is it not that simple?
No, you could, absolutely. And I have a few clients that have gone that route, but most don't want to go that restrictive, in terms of the obligations. They say, we're more comfortable with going with the GDPR because it's recognized and it is a very good foundation to base your program on, and it will capture the majority of the laws out there.
So let's just break down when we say data privacy, right?
Yeah.
Let's just break down the headline dot points of what we're actually practically talking about for people that might not really have a real sense of it. You've mentioned, is the website compliant, et cetera, et cetera. So let's just break down the 5 or 6 headline dot points so everyone's got a real sense of what we're actually really talking about here.
Okay. So for those who have heard me speak at different conferences, I always use the exact same analogy because it resonates with people. If you think about a bicycle wheel and you think about all the spokes on the wheel, data privacy and privacy itself is the wheel. It's the full life cycle of the personal data that you collect from the time you collect it to the time you destroy it. And it contains within privacy all the laws and regulations that define what you can collect, how you can collect it, what you can do with it, how long you can maintain it, where you can store it, who can have access to it. And it incorporates the records management component and the principles and rights that individuals have. The right to opt out of automated decision-making, the right to access their data, the right to ask for their data to be destroyed once it's no longer needed. So it's the best way to explain it is that full life cycle of the data from the time you collect it and the time you destroy it. A critical component is the lawful basis for collecting that data. So what is your legal basis for collecting it? Is it consent? Well, you're not going to get consent from employees because you need that data in order to employ them. So in that case, it would be a legal or contractual obligation.
Right.
You might need it for the basis of public interest, so national security. So that could be a basis. So there's very well-defined bases for collecting that data. Security is one spoke on that wheel of data.
Okay.
It's the spoke that protects that data from unlawful access and use or accidental loss and destruction. And you can't just think about security, which a lot of organizations do, because that means you're locking down data you legally may not be allowed to have because you didn't go through your privacy due diligence. And data breaches or privacy violations end up being much greater, or the privacy violations, I should say, is much greater than the data breach, because the data breach exposes what personal data you collected, and half the time you shouldn't have collected it, or you didn't have a lawful basis for collecting it. So that's kind of in a nutshell.
Yeah. Do you have any examples that you're familiar with or might have even been a part of having to recover from worldwide? I mean, in Australia, we've had a number of major data breaches that then did exactly what you said. It raised the specter of, well, hang on, how come you had all that privacy data about us? We've had kind of credit card banking systems. We've had a health insurer have a data breach, like big data breaches, millions of Australians that have, and of course the question that some of them were handled really badly by the organizations involved. Some were handled quite well. But I think one of the resounding things that most people felt was, how come you have that? How come you're holding that data about me, which is really what you're saying? So that data's gone in this breach, this security breach. But why did you have that data on me in the first place? Do you have any examples like that where there's been a security? I love that the security is a spoke, just a spoke. It's not the main game. It's not the main focus. But when the security's been breached, the data's gone, and then it raises this whole spectrum. You don't have to name a company or organization, of course, just the example will do, to help people contextualize the consequence of this even more.
Well, sure. There have been very, very serious violations. So in terms of data breaches, so if you think about the data breaches that have occurred in Australia, and certainly the data breaches that have occurred in the US,
Yes.
same very large financial institutions, federal government had a massive data breach that affected tens of millions of people. We've had healthcare organizations that have been breached. The issue is that a breach is going to happen no matter what. No matter how secure you are, if someone wants to get into your environment, they're going to get into your environment, unfortunately. The bigger issue and the bigger sanctions have come from privacy violations. So when you see a lot of these social media companies that have been sanctioned by the European Union, you're looking at hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars. And this is for things like lack of transparency, utilizing a data in a secondary way that was never the initial purpose for which the person gave their consent, or it's not having a lawful basis for processing the data. It could be an illegal transfer of the data from the EU to an inadequate country without going through the compliance process. So it doesn't mean you can't ever transfer the data, but you have to go through the data privacy compliance process. Put the right policies and procedures in place, the right agreements, the right contractual clauses, have your registrations up to date. So there is a compliance process you can go through. But the point of all this is the higher sanctions and penalties have been for privacy violations, not data breaches.
Yeah. So interestingly, I live in the marketing and sales world.
Lucky you.
It's fairly common for, a company to promote another company's goods and services to their database.
Mm-hmm.
They're not actually giving the database to the other company. They're just doing a promotion to their database. Would that be something that the data was not collected for? Is that an example? You're promoting another company through your own database, or, I think people probably don't have a great definition of how much do you have to disclose to people in terms of what you're going to do with the data once you've collected it?
So you have to be incredibly and clearly transparent because it has to be if you're in the case of marketing, which, I said, oh, I'm really sorry because unfortunately marketing is directly impacted by these laws. And one of my nephews is the director of digital marketing for a large multinational company. And he doesn't like when I go into privacy laws. I'm like, you're doing what with what? So he has to face it all the time. But what happens is in terms of marketing, you're relying on consent as your lawful basis if it's unsolicited marketing.
Yeah.
So you're targeting people that you've never targeted before and you do not have a relationship with them. So you have to reach out to them. You get a one time to, sort of explain who you are and what you're doing and what you want to obtain their consent. If you don't have their consent, you cannot continue to communicate and market to them in most jurisdictions around the world because the default is normally they're opted out until they explicitly opt in. Now it's different in the US. You're opted in until you explicitly opt out. So it's a little frustrating for those of us that care about privacy. But what happens is in your terms, so on your website, in your terms and conditions that you list, and one of the things might be we share your data with our third-party partners. If you have that statement in there, you also have to link to who your partners are so that clear and transparency around we know who the data is going to. And people have the right to say, no, I want to hear from you, but I don't want to hear from those third parties. So it's sort of that preferential opt-in, opt-out, what they can pick. If you already have a relationship with the individual or the company is a customer of yours, then you are allowed to market them as long as it's directly related to the products and services you already provide to them. So there's a little bit different about solicited marketing and unsolicited marketing.
Oh, that's it. So that is interesting. It's very common, particularly in the entrepreneurial space, for people to co-promote, and it's not always necessarily directly linked to, a consultancy that provides marketing strategies, promoting to their own database. So, they haven't shared the database, but they're marketing to their own database about a company that provides financial management strategies.
Yeah.
Would have a hard time saying this is directly linked to the products and services that we deliver. Am I right in that kind of mini example?
That falls into the where you're going to have to get consent to market
Okay,
to,
interesting.
and then you always have to offer the opt out at
Yes.
any point, even after you've gotten consent. What happens too is with marketing, a lot of organizations, the brokers sell lists, so that you can market. But what happens is if you rely on the data broker and they provide a necessary service. If the data broker says, oh yeah, we have the consent of the individuals to provide you the information and you can use it, you need to verify that consent's in place because the onus is going to be on you if you bought that list. When you reach out to the individuals on the list, which you can do, but you have to say where you got their information from, bought it from, this list from this company, and then explain why you're reaching out and then ask for their consent to continue to market to you because the lawful basis will be consent. And it has to be an explicit, not an implied consent.
So when you speak at a conference with a room full of business owners, do you find people throwing their hands in the air 5 minutes in to your presentation going, oh my goodness, this is way more than I think we've ever anticipated and we need to get our heads in the game really quickly?
That's normally the reaction, yes. But then as I explain to them, I'm not here to say no, and I'm really not. I'm not here to tell you you can't do it. What I'm here to tell you is we need to figure out how you can do it lawfully, legally, and make sure that you're in compliance with the law. So it's not a no, but you've got to do it in a different way than you've been doing it, and we'll work together to figure that out. So it's funny because marketing isn't the only one. I mean, IT, especially as they want to take advantage of new technology, has to go through a data privacy assessment as well. And so, the initial reaction is, oh, no, we have to do this because she's probably going to say no. And then the more that, I work with companies and work with individuals, they realize, oh, she's not really here to say no. She's here to figure out how we can do it legally.
So,
And that's what most, privacy attorneys and data protection officers should be doing. We shouldn't be saying no.
Well, let's actually make data privacy. Let's reframe it. into a strategic competitive advantage, right, for business. And so, you do talk about the importance of digital trust. And, there's no doubt that we live in a world today where trust and trustworthiness and the ability to believe in companies you're buying from is more important than it's ever been. And, you know, an individual's fundamental right to privacy is you breach that, and you've probably breached all levels of trust. Do you have an example, for example, where a company has actually used data privacy, got on the front foot and used their data privacy strategy almost as a strategic competitive advantage? We take this seriously. So oftentimes the data privacy stuff is buried into the condition terms and conditions pages on the footer, if you find it and click on it and bother to read it, or minimalistic statements around the opt-in to cookies and things like that. But do you have any examples of companies that have actually gone, you know what, we're going to use data privacy to demonstrate such a high level of transparency, people will just have this innate sense that we are way more trustworthy than most other people? I think it can be a strategic advantage for people.
Absolutely. And I talk about that all the time. Instead of turning privacy into a disadvantage, you turn it into an advantage and it becomes your competitive advantage. And it's by being open and transparent and answering the privacy questions before the people ask them. So being very upfront about what data you collect and what you do with it. And be very upfront about being able to describe your privacy program and what the basis of your privacy program is. And one of the things that I have seen over the years is that, especially in the last couple of years, privacy has become more critical in contract negotiations where companies are being asked about their privacy program. And one of the things that drives me insane is when I'm negotiating a contract and I ask about the privacy program and I want to know what their privacy foundation is. I want to know what their privacy program looks like. I want to know who their data protection officer is. I want my privacy questions answered. When they come back with a full dissertation on their security protocols, I will immediately walk away because they don't understand privacy. Or if it's a meeting and they explain their security to me, I'll say, that's great. I like that you have great security, but you haven't answered my privacy question yet. So your competitive advantage is going to be understanding and being able to articulate what privacy is and what your program is based on.
Interesting. I've just made a mental note. Don't launch into the security protocols when I'm trying to engage in a privacy conversation with someone that can help. I think transparency is one of the modern currencies of commerce today. And, organizations that are going to market to try and hide things increasingly will get found out, just because of how much is out there and the ability for people to find things out. We should lean into AI a little bit, because AI is starting to breach. Well, I don't know if it is or not. I'm interested in your responses, but the questions are being raised about AI, the ethics and the ethical use of it. Is privacy being breached as the large language models, beaver away? Is everything that we're putting into search engines or into websites now being consumed by the AI models? Can I get a headline observation from you about AI, and then we might dive into some of the detail underneath that through this lens of data privacy?
Well, the biggest threat to data privacy today is AI. And that does not mean that organizations shouldn't take advantage of the benefits of AI, but it means that organizations need to do privacy assessments before they even consider rolling out AI. And because there's so many issues around it, what data are you using in your AI models? If you're the builder or the developer of the AI technology, what data are you using to train your models? Are you using your customers' data? Are you using public data? Are you scraping data from public websites or from social media pages? If you're a company that's implementing AI, how do you know that the data that you're using within the AI technology is not being used by the developer to train and build the AI models? Where's the data going to reside? How can the data be deleted? One of the principles of data protection laws is banning automated decision making. You have to have human intervention. So how can you comply with the data protection laws if you have AI making all the decisions? So how do you ensure that there's still human interaction when you're using AI technology? And how do you determine whether or not the export, the final, document or whatever, the final product that comes out of AI is not biased? And how do you verify the accuracy of the information that's being provided through the AI technology? So I'm working with a number of companies that were on the AI journey, and I'm saying, no, we definitely can take advantage of AI, but we need to have an AI privacy policy, an AI policy, guidelines for individuals of what data you can put into the environment, what you can't put into the environment. Start small. There should be an absolute detailed AI privacy impact assessment conducted to identify and mitigate any risks up front. So there's a number of issues that have to be looked at around AI. And then there's also, ethical issues too about, how are younger people today going to learn how to write documents if they're going to be 100% reliant on AI technology to generate documents for them? So there becomes this human issue of, are we going to have robotic people now because individuals can't generate their own document? They can't write. They rely on AI, and that's going to be a real concern. Some of the benefits, being able to, like one of the HR organizations I was working with, they wanted to generate employment agreement templates using AI. And I said, that's fine, as long as you're only generating the template. But they said, no, 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 we want to actually issue the contract using AI. I'm like, no, 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 you can't do that, because that's when you're getting in there and you're putting personal data, people's names, salary numbers, government identification information, information. No, you can generate the template as long as it has no personal data in there. But the minute personal data goes in there, now you have a problem.
Well, and it seems to still be quite difficult to get definitive answers from companies providing AI solutions about where the data is living, what they're using to train their models with, and all the privacy due diligence that you want to do doesn't seem to be easy to get from the companies providing a number of these models, depending on the size of the company. And because the rate of acceleration of AI products coming onto the market is so explosive right now, you could actually have quite a small company offering an AI solution that all of a sudden becomes popular and everybody's using it, and they don't really have any data privacy built into the platform. It's a little bit of the Wild West just at the moment, and we're trying to maintain some regulatory framework, over the top of that. I'd love to get your opinion on something. You talked about human intervention. And I don't know if this has been true for any of your clients, but there's a real trend right now, but generally speaking, amongst more entrepreneurial organizations, so often privately owned companies and things like that, to replace the human salespeople with an AI agent that actually makes the sale. And they do it by talking to the client in voice. So they're having a sales call with a client, and they've been trained to have a really coherent, well-structured sales conversation with a prospect. They say, hey, I'm an AI agent, but if you'd like to speak to a real person, you can. However, I can help you with this decision you're trying to make, and I can step you through all the questions you will ask, and away they go. And it will close the sale and onboard the client with no human involved. I'd love to get your response to that.
Yeah, it is happening today. Now, the one good thing is the transparency piece, where they are saying, I am an AI agent, because that's number one, you have to be transparent about it. And the fact that the individual has the right to say, no, I want to talk to a person. Now, what happens is the human intervention comes in, it's required when it's making any type of decision that's going to impact the individual's, life in terms of, so employment. There has to be a human intervention when it has to do with the employment relationship.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily required from a customer relationship unless the AI agent is collecting financial data that directly is tied to the individual and not the organization. So if they're collecting the credit card information or banking details, then there does have to be human intervention, because you have to make sure that the information is correct, and you need to know where that information is going. So where is it being stored? Who's going to have access to it? So it goes back again to high risk type of AI, where you're with data that can actually lead to harm. And so some of the new regulations that have come out around AI talk about the restrictions on high risk use of AI. And that would be for any type of sensitive data, personal data, or data that could cause the individual any type of harm, that AI can't be used under those circumstances. Now, I get frustrated when I'm on a call and it's an AI because they only have so many limits. And then it gets to the point where they can't answer your call anymore, because if you ask a question that's not on their cheat sheet, it's frustrating because you can't get an answer. And they keep saying, I don't understand you. I don't understand you. Ask the question again. Then I'm screaming at my machine, I asked you the question 9,000 times.
Yeah. But that intersection of collecting personal data, I mean, increasingly, if you go to a hospital these days, you probably fill out an intake form, and
Yeah.
you probably do that through a portal or a website, and that form almost certainly has AI sitting behind it these days, and that's pretty serious personal information that's actually being gathered about an individual. And you would hope that that those health providers have significant data privacy in place.
Yeah.
But is there any correlation between the size of the organizations and their resources and the level of data privacy that's being managed? Smaller, less resourced, just might not have had the capacity to put in place some of the things you're talking about. It's a challenging, interesting conflict.
It absolutely is. And so the smaller the organization, the harder it is. But they're also the ones, especially if they're startups, that pay a little bit more attention. And even though they really don't have the revenue stream to go out and, engage, a long-term data protection officer. I have a lot of smaller companies that reach out to me for advice and guidance, and I'll do small projects with them because they want to start out on the right foot. Believe it or not, it's the big companies, the big players that have big privacy offices that aren't compliant. And because they are so big and so well known, that organizations assume that their privacy program is stellar, where they might be good, but if you read their terms and conditions, you go, wait a minute, they're not being upfront with me about what they're doing with my data. And I was just reviewed a new data protection agreement for a very, very large technology company, where they sent the new DPA, data processing agreement, over, because I wanted to see the AI component of it. I wanted to see what their terms were and their privacy practice around AI. They didn't even include AI in it, even though AI was the product they were offering. So I had to go back to my client and say, you can't sign this. They don't even talk about AI. So, oftentimes the bigger players say, well, you already have a contract with us and a data processing agreement, so you're good to go. And my thing is, no, the current data processing agreement we have has to do with your products and services, not related to AI. So we need something that's related to AI. So it's funny, the smaller ones, they don't have the resources, but they have the concern.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. In the time that we have left, I'd love to lean in a little bit. We've sort of edged around the corners of this, but law, medicine, the professions used to, once upon a time, start with all undergrads having to study ethics and philosophy, and it's not so much the case worldwide anymore, but there's an intersection between the legal, the ethical, and the technological. And I think I'd love to go back to that conversation just to round this out and, get your observations on the intersection of that, because I feel like we're losing some of that.
You're absolutely right. And the ethical is absolutely critical. The whole ethical use of data, the whole transparency use of data, the legal requirements that define why and when you need data, and the concept of data minimization, that goes to the ethical use of data. Only collect the data you absolutely have to have in order to provide the service you're providing or manage the relationship you're managing. You don't need tons of data. You just need the must-haves, not the nice-to-haves. And that does translate to the ethics. But unfortunately, um, with technology moving so quickly and people buying into the cool factor, which there are some pretty cool things going on, ethics is often talked about, but in reality ignored.
Mm.
And so with the growth of AI, I am definitely hearing more about ethical use of data. And as a matter of fact, I just got invited to join a council. I took the oath of office 2 weeks ago in London for the Global Council for Responsible AI. And the council is focused on transparent, ethical use and deployment of AI and compliant from a privacy and security space. So it's, looking at putting the ethics back into the use of any kind of data and making sure that technology thinks about their ethical choices when they're, building any type of new product that could impact an individual.
Is it an inverse relationship between the coolness of an AI solution and its ethical robustness? Is at the moment, is it an inverse correlation?
Yeah, it is
So the
definitely.
cooler it is, the less ethical it's likely to be,
Exactly.
or
And
ethically
so
robust.
eventually it's to catch up. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. What advice would you give to, if someone's listening to this and they're thinking, I am fascinated by this stuff, and that's the world I want to live in. That's the world I want to be a professional in. I think you've already given some really clear insights about security is not data privacy. One is not the same. Um, Technical expertise only does not equip you to be a data privacy advisor, consultant. Um, I think it's a set of skills that any business leader needs to rapidly wrap their head around, or at least a level of awareness. But if someone's thinking, I just love this, and I'd love to figure out, where to play, and you think about yourself back when, and having come through, 100% of what you do is loaded on your wisdom. What would the advice be that you give to someone who's going, I just want to get into this and be a part of this?
Yeah. I think if someone really wants to get into it, they need to really find someone who understands, data protection law, who's in that business. I mean, I'm happy to have people reach out to me. That's not a problem at all, or companies that need advice and guidance. And then think seriously about how you want to commit yourself to it, because you're going to need to go to law school. You're going to have to focus on privacy. You need to learn the legal side of it. You need to understand the technical side of it. You don't have to be a techie, but you need to be able to assess the technology and be able to communicate with the technical people. Techies normally aren't data protection officers. That's not the background. It's usually a legal and risk background. Privacy does not normally sit in compliance either. Compliance is very separate. They're aligned but separate. Privacy is even by law an independent function that can't be dictated by the business. So you can't have a CEO telling the privacy officer
Interesting.
conflict of interest. So it's an independent role. That's one of the reasons too why so many people jumped on the bandwagon when the GDPR came out, because the data protection officer role was protected. And so people say, "Oh, I'm going to be a data protection officer," even though I didn't have a background in it. But I'm going to go out and get a CIPP certification, even though they don't have any experience in it. But yeah, so that's one of the reasons. So it's really making sure you understand what it is you love. Do you love the privacy side? Do you love the legal aspect? Do you love the working with companies to do the privacy due diligence? Ask people, seek out mentors who can give you advice and guidance on where to go. And like I said, I'm always happy to talk to people if they're thinking about going in that direction.
But certainly don't make the assumption that if you worked in the data privacy area of an organization and was involved in it, that you could then leave that organization and set up a consultancy as a data privacy expert.
No. I mean, you could, but it would depend on how much expertise you bring with you.
Well, I think also what we all need to recognize is that 160 plus countries that have different levels of law and requirement around this. you do have to understand the structure of law
Yeah.
and what law as is, not so much the specific laws. Law is the laws that are written, but also the structure of the legal framework, and
Right.
that's a pretty key thing that all law training provides people with. It's the structure of law that makes a difference. What do you want people as a last thought? And then I'd love to have some fast questions with you in
Okay.
a minute.
Yeah.
Yeah, like just to finish off with a bit of fun. But what would you, if I let you provide any framing that you liked, and you wanted company leaders and executives that are listening to this episode, young leaders that are emerging that are listening to this episode, to come away with a compelling frame or thought in their mind that they never forget about data privacy, and they heard it from you, like, just hold this in mind no matter what would you frame up for them?
Well, that's a really good question. I think it has to be really compelling. There'd be a couple of things. I would say privacy can be your competitive advantage. And if you ignore privacy, it can be your reputational damage.
Mm.
And once your reputation is hurt, it's hard to get it back. And I've seen a lot of companies destroyed because they did not take privacy seriously. And once you have a sanction, it stays on the books. And companies remember that. Do they want to do business with this company that had a massive data privacy sanction for a privacy violation? Data breaches, people get over. They understand it's how you handle it. But a privacy violation, that's going to ruin your company.
Yeah. And then I'd probably add to that, something that you said that leapt out at me, which other people have said, but it's not landed with me in the same context as it did when you said it. Just get the data you need
Yeah,
to serve the
absolutely.
client. And companies are kind of obsessed about getting all the data they can on a
Yeah.
client, but just get the data you need to serve them.
Yeah. And it's not just clients, employees. You don't need to collect every bit of information on employees. You don't need to know what their hobbies are. The more data you collect, the more personal data you collect, the more you put yourself and the company at risk.
Interesting. So let's have some fast questions in the context of data privacy, and
Okay.
data privacy and security, but really data privacy. So if you could travel to, you gave us some date, some years, 1998. The GDPR was
18,
2018. But if
2018.
you could travel to any time in history around data privacy, where would you, and you get to observe what's going on right there, where is the most interesting kind of period of time for you in terms of data privacy, and why?
I'd probably go back to 1994 when the EU Data Protection Directive, the first one, was being formed. And all of the meetings that were going on between the member states to come out with one directive that could basically appeal and appease a number of countries with different data protection laws. I mean, you look at Germany being very restrictive versus another member state that might not be quite as restrictive. So I think 1994 to 1996, before the directive came out in 1998, I'd like to go back to.
Interesting. Is that information, are there records from that the people that are interested could read?
Yeah, there are records go way, way back. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So if someone wanted to embark on this journey to being a data privacy consultant, expert, or whatever, it wouldn't hurt to go back and read some of the pivotal material. Who are the big figures? Is there somebody who are the giant thinkers of data privacy that, if you could get inside their head and just understand how they even think about this, do those people exist in data privacy?
That's an interesting question. That's a hard one. I don't know that I can answer. There's not like one person that stands out. There's a number of people that are involved, and certainly there is a gentleman that I would love to get inside of his head, to be honest, Max Schrems. And Max Schrems is well known in the privacy industry. He has been probably the facilitator and the responsible party who I greatly admire for the downfall of Safe Harbor and the Privacy Shield, which was the US EU framework. to obtain adequacy for the US, and both of those frameworks were invalidated. And Max is an incredible human being.
Well, you might be one of those people though, Sheila.
Well,
that
I would hope that people think that, but
yeah, you might be one of those people that people would love to be able to understand how the back of your mind works as you
yeah.
present what the front of the mind is actually sharing with people, you know. What and so to that extent, around data privacy, is there any sort of personal philosophy or maxim that you hold to be true or always, that you might not express it to people you're speaking to, but it's, so I'll give you an example. I have a fundamental belief that free enterprise is one of the most powerful forces we've got on the planet, as long as it's being led by the right people. And if it's not, it can become the most destructive force. So that informs a lot of what I think about and how I work with clients. It's a philosophy that I have. Do you have a personal philosophy or maxim around data privacy that just seems to underpin everything you talk about?
I do, but I don't know if it's in the same context as what you just said, because yours is, I'd love to steal yours. It's I am passionate about privacy, absolutely passionate about privacy. And for me to be, good, excel at what I do, that passion has to come through. And I like to turn, my clients, people that want to connect with me, into, passionate privacy people that take it seriously. And I would love to see privacy on the forefront of every board meeting, and that board members are passionate about organizations, just consuming as much privacy information as they can, and really building a privacy compliant organization from the ground up. Not just talk about it, but actually do it and turn it into a passionate competitive advantage. That's just
Okay.
my word.
So that just sparks up one last question, which I hadn't planned, but we said privacy can be a competitive advantage for the companies that do it well, right? It certainly can be your biggest risk factor. But
Right.
if we talk about from a marketing point of view and showing up in the marketplace and people making judgments about you, can the public tell the difference when they're seeing a company that says they're focused on privacy and it's driven by leaders that are passionate about it, versus a company that says we're focused on privacy, we have policies and we've got the mechanism? Can you actually almost tell the difference when there's passion driving it?
Yeah, you really can. Because if they're passionate about it, they can really talk about it. If they're not passionate about it, they'll say exactly what you say. Oh, we have a policy about that, or we have a cookie policy, we have a privacy policy. You can opt out, you can unsubscribe. It's sort of robotic. And when it's robotic, they're not passionate about it.
Right.
And you can go into an organization and the CEO of the company can actually mention privacy in a presentation, then they're passionate about it.
So it's actually not data privacy that is a competitive advantage at all. It's a passion for privacy that is a true competitive advantage.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Yes.
Fantastic. It's probably a great place to finish. Sheila, thank you so much. I mean, this is not a topic that a lot of people think that they need to have for the amount of time you and I have talked about it. I'm sure it's a topic that a lot of people would rather wasn't there so they can just do the things they want to do.
Yeah.
But you're quite right. It is a topic that can give a business success or actually destroy it. And I think as the world moves on and AI and technology advances, it's something that's going to impact us all. It already is. And maybe we do all need to be a whole lot more passionate about it. So thank you for giving this time to us. I really, really appreciate it. And I guess I'd say to everybody watching the episode, figure out how to find your level of passion for privacy, and who you need to be talking to be able to support that passion. Sheila, thank you very much for giving us this time.
Simon, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to speak to you, and I always am happy to talk about my passion.
Of course.